Four short stories by Damon Runyon. Social error. When Mr. Ziegfeld picks a doll, she is apt to be above the average when it comes to looks, for Mr. Ziegfeld is by no means a chump at picking dolls. But when Mr. Ziegfeld picks Miss Midgie Muldoon, he beats his own best record, or anyway ties it. I never see a better-looking doll in my life, although she is somewhat smaller than I like them. I like my dolls big enough to take a good hold on, and Miss Midgie Muldoon is only about knee-high to a Pomeranian. But she is very cute, and I do not blame handsome Jack Madigan for going daffy about her. Now, most any doll on Broadway will be very glad indeed to have handsome Jack Madigan give her a tumble. So it is very surprising to one and all when Miss Midgie Muldoon plays the chill for handsome Jack, especially when you figure that Miss Midgie Muldoon is nothing but a chorus doll, while handsome Jack is quite a high shot in this town. But one night in the hot box, when handsome Jack sends word to Miss Midgie Muldoon by Miss Billy Perry, who is Dave the Dude's wife, that he will like to meet up with her, Miss Midgie Muldoon sends word back to handsome Jack that she is not meeting up with tough guys. Well, naturally this crack burns handsome Jack up quite some. But Dave the Dude says never mind, and furthermore Dave says Miss Midgie Muldoon's crack serves handsome Jack right for sitting around shooting off his mouth and putting himself away as a tough guy. Because if there is anything Dave hates, it is a guy letting on he is tough, no matter how tough he really is, and handsome Jack is certainly such a guy. He is a big, tall, blond guy who comes up out of what they call Hell's Kitchen over on the west side. And if he has a little more sense, the chances are he will be as important a guy as Dave the Dude himself in time, instead of generally working for Dave. But handsome Jack likes to wear very good clothes and drink and sit around a lot, and also do plenty of talking. And no matter how much dough he makes, he never seems to be able to hold much of anything. Personally, I never care to have any truck with handsome Jack because he always strikes me as a guy who is a little too quick on the trigger to suit me. And I always figure the best you are going to get out of being around guys who are quick on the trigger is the worst of it. And so, any time I see handsome Jack, I give him the back of my neck. But there are many people in this world, such as Basil Valentine, who love to be around these characters. Now, this Basil Valentine is a little guy who wears horned cheaters and writes articles for the magazines, and is personally a very nice little guy, and as harmless as a water snake. But he cannot have a whole lot of sense, or he will not be hanging out with handsome Jack and other such characters. If a guy hangs out with tough guys long enough, he is apt to get to thinking maybe he is tough himself, and by other people may get the idea he is tough. And the first thing you know, along comes some copper in plain clothes, such as Johnny Brannigan of the Strong Arm Squad, and biffs him on the noggin with a blackjack, just to see how tough he is. As I say, Basil Valentine is a very harmless guy, but after he is hanging out with handsome Jack a while, I hear Basil talking very tough to a busboy, and the chances are he is building himself up to talk tough to a waiter, and then maybe to a head waiter. And finally, he may consider himself tough enough to talk tough to anybody. I can show you many a guy who was supposed to be strictly legitimate sitting around with guys who are figured as tough guys. And why this is, I do not know. But I am speaking to Waldo Winchester, the newspaper scribe, about the proposition one night, and Waldo Winchester, who is a half-smart guy in many respects, says it is what is called an underworld complex. Waldo Winchester says many legitimate people are much interested in the doings of tough guys and consider them very romantic. And he says if I do not believe it, look at all the junk the newspapers print making heroes out of tough guys. Waldo Winchester says the underworld complex is a very common complex, and that Basil Valentine has it. And so has Miss Harriet McKyle, or she will not be all the time sticking her snoot into joints where tough guys hang out. This Miss Harriet McKyle is one of these rich dolls who wears snaky-looking evening clothes and has her hair cut like a boy's, with her ears sticking out, and is always around the night traps, generally with some guy with a little mustache, and a way of talking like an Englishman. And come to think of it, I do see her in tough joints more than somewhat, saying hello to different parties, such as nobody in their right minds will say hello to, including such as Red Henry, who is just back from Dannemora after being away for quite a spell for taking things out of somebody's safe and blowing the safe open to take these things. In fact, I see Miss Harriet McKyle dancing one night in the Hearts and Flowers Club, which is a very tough joint indeed. And who is she dancing with but Red Henry? And when I ask Waldo Winchester what he makes of this proposition, he says it is part of the underworld complex he's talking about. He says Miss Harriet McKyle probably thinks it's smart to tell her swell friends she dances with a safe blower. Although personally, if I am going to dance with a safe blower at all, which does not seem likely, I will pick me out a nicer safe blower than Red Henry, because he is such a guy as does not take a bath since he leaves Dannemora, and he is back from Dannemora for several months. One party who does not seem to have much of Waldo Winchester's underworld complex, as far as I can see, is Miss Midgie Muldoon, because I never see her around any night traps except such as the Hot Box and the 1600 Club, which are considered very nice places, and reasonably safe for anybody who does not get too far out of line. And Miss Midgie Muldoon is always with some very legitimate guys, such as Buddy Donaldson, the songwriter, or Walter Gumble, who plays the trombone in Paul Whiteman's band, or maybe sometimes with Paul Hawley, the actor. Furthermore, when she is around such places, Miss Midgie Muldoon minds her own business quite a bit, and always looks right past handsome Jack Madigan, which burns Jack up all the more. It is the first time handsome Jack ever runs into a doll who does not seem excited about him, and he does not know what to make of such a situation. Well, what happens but Dave the Dude comes to me one day and says to me like this. Listen, Dave says, this doll, Miss Harriet McKyle, is one of my best customers for high-grade merchandise, and is as good as wheat in the bin, and she is asking a favor of me. She is giving a party on Sunday night in her joint over on Park Avenue, and she wishes me to invite some of the mob. So go around and tell about a dozen guys to be there all dressed and not get too fresh, because a big order of scotch and champagne goes with the favor. Now, such a party is by no means unusual, although generally it is some swell guy who gives it rather than a doll, and he gets Broadway guys to be there to show his pals what a mixer he is. Waldo Winchester says it is to give color to things, though where the color comes in I do not know, for Broadway guys such as will go to a party like this are apt to just sit around and say nothing and act very gentlemanly, because they figure they are on exhibition like freaks, and the only way you can get them to such parties in the first place is through some such connection as Miss Harriet McKyle has with Dave the Dude. Anyway, I go around and about and tell a lot of guys what Dave the Dude wishes them to do, and among others I tell Handsome Jack, who is tickled to death by the invitation, because if there is anything Handsome Jack loves more than anything else, it is to be in a spot where he can show off some. Furthermore, Handsome Jack has a sneaking idea Miss Harriet McKyle is red hot for him, because sometimes she gives him the old eye when she sees him around the 1600 Club and other spots. But then she does the same thing to Big Nig and a lot of other guys I can mention, because that is just naturally the way Miss Harriet McKyle is. But of course I do not speak of this to Handsome Jack. Basil Valentine is with Jack when I invite him, so I tell Basil to come along too, because I do not wish him to think I am a snob. It turns out that Basil is one of the very first guys to show up Sunday night at Miss Harriet McKyle's apartment, where I am already on hand to help get in the scotch and champagne, and to make Miss Harriet McKyle acquainted with such of the mob as I invite, although I find we are about lost in the shuffle of guys with little mustaches, and dolls in the type of evening clothes that leave plenty of them sticking out here and there. It seems everybody on Broadway is there, as well as a lot of Park Avenue, and Mr. Ziegfeld is especially well represented. And among his people I see Miss Midgie Muldoon, although I have to stand on tiptoe to see her on account of the guys with little mustaches around her, and their interest in Miss Midgie Muldoon proves that they are not such saps as they look, even if they do wear little mustaches. It is a very large apartment, and the first thing I notice is a big green parrot swinging in a ring hung from the ceiling in a corner of what seems to be the main room. And the reason I notice this parrot is because it is letting out a squawk now and then and yelling different words, such as Polly wants a cracker. There are also a lot of canary birds hung around the joint, so I judge Miss Harriet McKyle loves animals, as well as peculiar people, such as she has for guests. I am somewhat surprised to see Red Henry, all dressed up in evening clothes, moving around among the guests. I do not invite Red Henry, so I suppose Miss Harriet McKyle invites him, or he hears rumors of the party and just crashes in. But personally, I consider it very bad taste on Red Henry's part to show himself in such a spot, and so does everybody else that knows him, although he seems to be minding his own business pretty well. Finally, when the serious drinking is underway and a good time is being had by one and all, Miss Harriet McKyle comes over to me and says to me like this, "Now tell me about your different friends, so I can tell my other guests. They will be thrilled to death meeting these bad characters." "Well," I say, "you see the little guy over there staring at you as if you are a ghost or some such? Well, he is nobody but Bad Basil Valentine, who will kill you quicker than you can say scat, and maybe quicker. He is undoubtedly the toughest guy here tonight, or anywhere else in this man's town for that matter. Yes, ma'am, Bad Basil Valentine is one dead tough mug, I say, although he is harmless looking at this time. Bad Basil kills many a guy in his day. In fact, Miss McKyle, I say, Bad Basil can scarcely sleep good any night he does not kill some guy. My goodness, Miss Harriet McKyle says, looking Basil over very carefully. He does not look so bad at first glance, although now that I examine him closely, I believe I do detect a sinister gleam in his eye. Well, Miss Harriet McKyle can hardly wait until she gets away from me, and the next I see of her she has Basil Valentine surrounded, and is almost chewing his ear off as she gabs to him, and anybody can see that Basil is all pleasured up by this attention. In fact, Basil is snagged if ever I see a guy snagged, and personally I do not blame him, because Miss Harriet McKyle may not look a million, but she has a couple, and you can see enough of her in the evening clothes to know that nothing about her is phony. The party is going big along toward 1 o'clock, when all of a sudden in comes handsome Jack Madigan with half a heat on, and in 5 minutes he is all over the joint, drinking everything that is offered him and making a fast play for all the dolls and talking very loud. He is sored up more than somewhat when he finds Miss Harriet McKyle does not give him much of a tumble, because he figures she will be calling him on top the minute he blows in. But Miss Harriet McKyle is too busy with Basil Valentine, finding out from Basil how he knocks off 6 of Al Capone's mob out in Chicago one time when he is out there on a pleasure trip. Well, while feeling sore about Miss Harriet McKyle passing him up for Basil Valentine, and not knowing how it comes Basil is in so stout with her, handsome Jack bumps into Red Henry, and Red Henry makes some fresh crack to Jack about Basil moving in on him, which causes handsome Jack to hit Red Henry on the chin, and knock him half into the lap of Miss Midgie Muldoon, who was sitting in a chair with a lot of little mustaches around her. Naturally, this incident causes some excitement for a moment, but the way Miss Midgie Muldoon takes it is very surprising. She just sort of dusts Red Henry off her and stands up no bigger than a demi-tasse and looks handsome Jack right in the eye very cool and says, "Ah, a parlor tough guy." Then she walks away, leaving handsome Jack with his mouth open, because he does not know up to this moment that Miss Midgie Muldoon is present. Well, somebody heaves Red Henry out of the joint and the party continues, but I see handsome Jack wandering around looking very lonesome, and with not much speed left compared to what he brings in. Somehow I figure handsome Jack is looking for Miss Midgie Muldoon, but she keeps off among the little mustaches, and finally handsome Jack takes to belting the old grape right freely to get his zing back. He gets himself pretty well organized, and when he suddenly comes upon Miss Midgie Muldoon standing by herself for a moment, he is feeling very brisk indeed, and he says to her like this, "Hello, beautiful, are you playing the hard to get for me?" But Miss Midgie Muldoon only looks him in the eye again and says, "Ah, the parlor tough guy. Go away, tough guy. I do not like tough guys." Well, this is not so encouraging when you come to think of it, but handsome Jack is a guy who will never be ruled off for not trying with the dolls, and he is just about to begin giving her a little more work when all of a sudden a voice goes, "Ha, ha, ha," and then it says, "Hello, you fool." Now, of course, it is nothing but the parrot talking, and it says again, "Ha, ha, ha, hello, you fool." Of course, the parrot, whose name turns out to be Polly, does not mean handsome Jack, but of course handsome Jack does not know the parrot does not mean him, and naturally he feels very much insulted. Furthermore, he has plenty of champagne inside of him. So all of a sudden, he outs with the old equalizer and lets go at Polly, and the next minute there are green feathers flying all over the joint, and poor old Mr. or maybe Mrs. Polly is stretched out as dead as a doornail, and maybe deader. Well, I never see a doll carry on like Miss Harriet McKyle does when she finds out her Polly is a goner, and what she says to handsome Jack is really very cutting and quite extensive, and the chances are handsome Jack will finally haul off and smack Miss Harriet McKyle in the snoot. Only he realizes he is already guilty of a very grave social error in shooting the parrot, and he does not wish to make it any worse. Anyway, Miss Midgie Muldoon is standing looking at handsome Jack out of her great big round beautiful eyes, with what Waldo Winchester, the scribe, afterwards tells me is plenty of scorn, and it looks to me as if handsome Jack feels worse about Miss Midgie Muldoon's looks than he does about what Miss Harriet McKyle is saying to him. But Miss Midgie Muldoon never opens her mouth. She just keeps looking at him for quite a spell, and then finally walks away, and it looks to me as if she is ready to bust out crying any minute, maybe because she feels sorry for Polly. Well, naturally, Handsome Jack's error busts up the party, because Miss Harriet McKyle does not wish to take any chances on Handsome Jack starting in to pot her canaries. So we all go away, leaving Miss Harriet McKyle weeping over what she can find of Polly, and Basil Valentine crying with her, which I consider very chummy of Basil at that. A couple of nights later, Basil comes into Mindy's restaurant where I happen to be sitting with Handsome Jack, and anybody can tell that Basil is much worried about something. "Jack," he says, "Miss Harriet McKyle is very, very, very angry about you shooting Polly. In fact, she hates you, because Polly is a family heirloom." "Well," Jack says, "tell her I apologize, and we'll get her a new parrot as soon as I get the price. You know I am broke now. Tell her I am very sorry, although," Jack says, "her parrot has no right to call me a fool, and I leave this to anybody." "Miss Harriet McKyle is after me every day to shoot you, Jack," Basil says. "She thinks I am a very tough guy, and that I will shoot anybody on short notice, and she wishes me to shoot you. In fact, she is somewhat displeased because I do not shoot you when you shoot poor Polly. But of course I explained to her I do not have a gun at the moment. Now Miss McKyle says if I do not shoot you, she will not love me, and I greatly wish to have Miss Harriet McKyle love me, because I am practically daffy about her. So," Basil says, "I am wondering how much you will take to hold still and let me shoot you, Jack." "Why," Handsome Jack says, very much astonished, "you must be screwy." "Of course I do not mean to really shoot you, Jack," Basil says. "I mean to maybe shoot you with a blank cartridge, so Miss Harriet McKyle will think I am shooting you sure enough, which will make her very grateful to me. I am thinking that maybe I can pay you $1,500 for such a job, although this sum represents nearly my life savings." "Why," Handsome Jack says, "your proposition sounds very reasonable at that. I am just wondering where I can get a hold of a few bobs to send Miss Midgie Muldoon a bar pin or some such, and see if I cannot round myself up with her. She is still playing plenty of chill for me. You better make it $2,000 while you're about it." Well, Basil Valentine finally agrees to pay the $2,000. Furthermore, Basil promises to put the dough up in advance with Dave the Dude or some other reliable party, as that is rather an unusual business deal, and naturally Handsome Jack wishes to have his interests fully protected. Well, the thing comes off a few nights later in the hot box, and it is all pretty well laid out in advance. It is understood that Basil is to bring Miss Harriet McKyle into the hot box after regular hours, when there are not apt to be too many people around, and to find Handsome Jack there. Basil is to out with a gun and take a crack at Handsome Jack, and Handsome Jack is to let on he is hit, and Basil is to get Miss Harriet McKyle out of the joint in the confusion. Handsome Jack promises to lay low a few weeks afterwards, so it will look as if he is dead, and Basil figures that in the meantime Miss Harriet McKyle will be so grateful to him that she will love him very much indeed, and maybe marry him, which is really the big idea with Basil. It is pretty generally known to one and all what is coming off, and quite a number of guys drift into the hot box during the night, including Dave the Dude, who seems to be getting quite a bang out of the situation. But who also bobs up very unexpectedly but Miss Midgie Muldoon, with Buddy Donaldson, the songwriter. Handsome Jack is all upset by Miss Midgie Muldoon being there, but she never as much as looks at him. So Handsome Jack takes to drinking scotch more than somewhat, and everybody commences to worry about whether he will hold still for Basil Valentine to shoot him, even with a blank cartridge. The hot box closes at 3 o'clock in the morning, and everybody is always turned out except the regulars. So by 3:30, there are only about a dozen guys and dolls in the joint when in comes Basil Valentine and Miss Harriet McKyle. Handsome Jack happens to be standing with his back to the door, and not far from the table where Miss Midgie Muldoon and this Buddy Donaldson are sitting, when Basil and Miss Harriet McKyle come in. And right away Basil sings out, his voice wobbling no little, "Handsome Jack Madigan, your time has come." At this, Handsome Jack turns around, and there is Basil Valentine tugging a big rod out of the hind pocket of his pants. The next thing anybody knows, there is a scream, and a doll's voice cries, "Jack! Look out, Jack!" And out of her seat and over to Handsome Jack Madigan bounces Miss Midgie Muldoon. And just as Basil finally raises the rod and turns it on, Miss Midgie Muldoon plants herself right in front of Jack and stretches out her arms on either side of her as if to shield him. Well, the gun goes bingo in Basil's hand, but instead of falling like he is supposed to, Handsome Jack stands there with his mouth open looking at Miss Midgie Muldoon, not knowing what to make of her jumping between him and the gun. And it is a good thing he does not fall at that, because he is able to catch Miss Midgie Muldoon as she starts to keel over. At first we think maybe it is only a feint, but she has on a low-neck dress, and across her left shoulder there slowly spreads a red smear. And what is this red smear but blood? And as Handsome Jack grabs her, she says to him like this, "Hold me, dear, I am hurt." Now this is the most unexpected indeed, and it is by no means a part of the play. Basil Valentine is standing by the door with the rod in his duke, looking quite astonished, and making no move to get Miss Harriet McKyle out of the joint as he is supposed to the minute he fires. And Miss Harriet McKyle is letting out a few offhand screams which are very piercing, and saying she never thinks that Basil will take her seriously and really plug anybody for her, although she says she appreciates his thoughtfulness at that. You can see Basil is standing there wondering what goes wrong, when Dave the Dude, who is a fast thinker under all circumstances, takes a quick peek at Miss Midgie Muldoon, and then jumps across the room and nails Basil. "Why," Dave says to Basil, "you are nothing but a rascal. You mean to kill him after all. You do not shoot a blank, you throw a slug, and you get Miss Midgie Muldoon with it in the shoulder." Well, Basil is a pretty sick-looking toad as Dave the Dude takes hold of him, and Miss Harriet McKyle is putting on a few extra yips when Basil says, "My goodness, Dave," he says, "I never know this gun is really loaded. In fact, I forget all about getting a gun of my own until the last minute, and am looking around for one when Red Henry comes along and says he will lend me his. I explain to him how the whole proposition is a joke, and I tell him I must have blanks, and he kindly takes the lead out of the cartridges in front of my own eyes and makes them blank. The chances are Red Henry works a quick change on you," Dave the Dude says. "Red Henry is very angry at Jack for hitting him on the chin." Then Dave takes the rod out of Basil's hand and breaks it open, and sure enough there are enough real slugs in it to sink a rowboat, and no blanks whatever, which surprises Basil Valentine no little. "Now," Dave says, "get away from here before Jack realizes what happens, and keep out of sight until you hear from me, because if Miss Midgie Muldoon croaks, it may cause some gossip. Furthermore," Dave says, "take this squawking doll with you." Well, you can see that Dave the Dude is pretty much steamed up, and he remains steamed up until it comes out that Miss Midgie Muldoon is only a little bit shot, and is by no means in danger of dying. We take her over to the Polyclinic Hospital, and a guy there digs the bullet out of her shoulder, and we leave her there with Handsome Jack holding her tight in his arms, and swearing he will never be tough again, but will get her a nice little home on Basil Valentine's $2,000, and find himself a job, and take no more part in his old life, all of which seems to sound fair enough. It is a couple of years before we hear of Miss Harriet McKyle again, and then she is Mrs. Basil Valentine, and is living in Naples over in Italy. And the people there are very much surprised because Mrs. Basil Valentine never lets Mr. Basil Valentine associate with guys over 10 years old, and never lets him handle anything more dangerous than a niblick. So, this is about all there is to the story, except that when Handsome Jack Madigan and Miss Midgie Muldoon stand up to be married by Father Leonard, Dave the Dude sizes them up a minute, and then turns to me and says like this, "Look," Dave says, "and tell me, where does Miss Midgie Muldoon's shoulder come up to on Jack's left side?" "Well," I say, "her shoulder comes just up to Jack's heart." "So you see," Dave says, "it is just as well for Jack she stops Basil's bullet at that."